welcome to another episode of the Tangent Podcast, a blue episode, entering our blue period. How are you doing today, Anthony?
I'm doing great. I just got another cup of coffee, and you have lemon juice.
Yeah, I'm drinking lemon juice with a little bit of green tea in it, and that's my own fault. You should not squeeze an entire lemon into a singular cup of green tea.
Yeah.
Anyway, one day we're going to get this intro thing down and be professional about it.
But that day is not today.
Yeah.
And when we get it right, you won't be here. You will be somewhere else.
What is that? What is the Aragorn speech? There will come a day where the strength of men shall fail. But it is not this day.
It is not this day. Yes.
But this is supposed to be a more focused episode.
Yes, focused. This is still the intro, so going over just stuff. The topic for today's podcast is obscure literature. Obscure literature genres.
Literature. And that was the only prerequisite that I gave you.
Yeah.
And then
I ran with it.
You ran with it,
and we went for a marathon.
Yeah, and as it actually turns out, we picked two pieces of obscure literature, not pieces, but two subgenres of obscure literature on the opposite end of the spectrum, which
one that is dead / dying, I guess. The other one which is on the rise.
Yeah, as long as the Tolkien estate keeps publishing his half-written journals and filling in the blanks.
I wouldn't even put Tolkien in that. I would say Tolkien is a different genre.
No, but there's some of what you're talking about keeps getting published from the Tolkien estate because he wrote a lot of that when he world built.
I mean, yeah, it makes sense.
Anyway, that we're getting off topic, so let's just get started so that I'm not alluding to what your obscure literature.
Well, before I get into it, two honorable mentions. That I
honorable mentions. Interesting.
That I was juggling back and forth between these three topics. The first one was gaslamp fantasy, also known as gaslight fantasy or gaslight romance. It is a mixture of both fantasy and historical fiction. It is not to be confused with steampunk.
Okay.
Steampunk is a much more super science edge. Gaslamp fantasy is usually more like a mix of fantasy and historical fiction. Victorian / Edwardian era.
Kind of like setting. Gotham by Gaslight, which was basically just a fantasy Batman story that took place in Victorian England.
Yeah. And what I learned, interestingly enough, some of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's books, so like the Sherlock Holmes books, are sometimes looped in with gaslight fantasy because gaslight fantasy, because there is a note of that fantasy element mixed in with the historical fiction when things are fantastic. If you want to explore that genre, I do have examples. The Brass Queen by Elizabeth Chatsworth and The Golem and the Genie by Helene Wecker.
Ironically enough, The Brass Queen, I don't know anything about that book, but that title has shown up multiple times in like recommended reading lists that have popped up for me just in things that I'm doing. So
and then of course Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, any of his books are examples of gaslamp fantasy, as I said before. I have not read the first two. They just came up in my research of what gaslamp fantasy was. That wasn't the focus of my topic, so I didn't do that much research, but the description sounded good. The title looked good. The book cover, don't judge a book by its cover, but too bad I just did.
It really should be judge only books by their cover. You know, like because books is the only thing where it's appropriate to judge it by its cover. That's the point of a cover.
Yeah, it's fair. But yeah, that's gaslamp fantasy. The other thing that I found, it's called Nordic noir. Yeah.
if you're just listening to this, I made a most egregious face because that fascinates me.
This is from Penguin Random House. For fans of crime fiction, Nordic noir represents the bleakest of the bleak, often centering on brutal crimes tinged with shocking violence. The tales invariably feature protagonists who, while possessing a generally ferocious sense of justice, are nonetheless tortured, brooding, and generally introspective. The settings, whether city streets or remote villages, are desolate and harsh. Combine these elements with densely plotted mysteries that often feature more than a few shocking turns and a Spartan direct prose style to accentuate the genre's dark themes. It is not difficult to see why Nordic noir has been so influential and successful piece of crime genre. Another description of Nordic noir that I found was to basically contrast the relatively blissful and mundane Nordic, so Scandinavian country experience with the horrific and sometimes violent, like gruesomely violent crimes that happen beneath the surface. I thought it was interesting. It was an interesting idea of like the dichotomy between like regular normal life and then like the brutal stuff that goes on behind the scenes that people don't talk about, almost like skeletons in the closet kind of thing. Then you have like your typical morose like detective, like kind of like Batman, to use Batman as another example of the other genre that I had as an honorable mention. An example of a book is I don't know how to pronounce this gentleman's name, but Peter Hoeg, Miss Smilla's Feeling for Snow. It's the name of the book. It came up a lot as a recommended title. Again, I haven't read it. I didn't do that much more research into it, but I think it was an interesting genre and an honorable mention. Just make sure if you go to read that book, you get the English version because most of them are published in Swedish and Scandinavian languages. So, for the obscure genre that I picked.
Drum roll, please. But we're not going to do that because it will do really... Okay, that's good. I was going to use my fists.
Beating the table.
Yeah.
Epic poetry. That's what I picked because everybody loves a good epic. Yeah, I picked epic poetry because I thought it was an interesting place to think about because kind of like what you said, it's a dying or dead genre. I don't know many people who go to the store and say, I want to read an epic poem. But I thought it was interesting to use as a source and as a point of defense to say it is a good analytical source in thinking about like what is the root of storytelling, like what is the heart of storytelling and narrative. I think analyzing epic poems and looking at it from a analytical perspective is important and good. I don't know if you can, maybe if you can read it and enjoy it, great. But that wasn't the heart of my defense, I'll say, of the epic poems.
Gotcha.
To give a few examples, the Epic of Gilgamesh is sometimes thought of as to be the oldest example of an epic poem. You have the classics, so the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Aeneid, which most people might not know, but is an extension of the Odyssey. It is the travels of Aeneas after the Trojan War. Beowulf, another good one, another classic story.
Right.
Paradise Lost, which is I picked because it was a recent example. Yeah. Recent in air quotes, circa 1667.
Yeah. Recent being very subjective. Right. Because when if you look at when I guess Gilgamesh would be published compared to now, it would be more recent than Gilgamesh.
Right. The I'm going to butcher this, Mahabharata.
Oh, don't worry, there's going to be a lot of butchering on my end too.
Which is a Sanskrit Indian epic poem, which I'll get into more later. I came across it, and there's a bit of an interesting story behind the Mahabharata. And then a Persian poem by the name of Shahnameh. And then you might ask, like, what makes an epic poem?
I would ask what makes an epic poem.
Epic poems are typically heroic in nature, so they're about a good protagonist. They're just good. They're good protagonists. There is a bit of an underlining characteristic behind the epic poems. There are differences between, like, the Indian epic poems, the Greek, I think it's the Sumerians who did the Epic of Gilgamesh. But that is one of the underlying principles. They typically have some aspect of mythology to them as well. You could even, depending on who you're asking, because Paradise Lost is the tale of Adam and Eve. You can use that as a source of mythology, depending on who you ask. Beowulf is littered with mythology.
He fights an entire monster underwater and never once mentions having to, breathe.
Yeah. I like Beowulf, unironically.
Beowulf is actually one of my favorite pieces of old literature that I read once, and I was like, wow, that was really good. I never want to read it again, but I always have a copy of it. Tolkien has a translation of Beowulf that I haven't been able to track down. But
side note and fun fact, there is a character Beowulf in the 2D fighting game Skullgirls who I love the character. He's super cool. I hate that Skullgirls is such a this is a bit of a brief aside. I hate that Skullgirls is a good game mechanically, because if you look at the game, you're like, oh, the game is really, it has a tone.
It has an audience. I was gonna say it has a specific audience.
Well, hold on. Let me just look up what Beowulf's character looks like, because he's kind of cool, and this is part of, like, my defense of epic poetry is because it's a good source of inspiration for, like, modern things. So you don't play as Beowulf. You play as a pro wrestler who's dressed up like Beowulf. Like he's got a hoodie that's Grundle.
That's awesome.
And he punches you. He has like a giant severed arm that he punches you with. He basically will like throw it at you. He's a chair. He like does a what's the move? A drop kick and stuff. Super cool. That's one of the reasons why I wanted to also mention it, is because it's interesting to see the source of inspiration of like this really but this very mythological source that's a the heroic character, but like reimagined in a more modern, a more cartoony, or just a different aspect, a different sense, especially a more digestible sense than epic poetry. But anyway, back to the defining characteristics of an epic poem. They typically are used, the Greek epics especially, where their primary use was performance. Whether it was in private or whether it was publicly, the poems were used for performance. And so you have the meters, for examples, you have the hexameter and the iambic pentameter, which were used because you need a good structure to remember things, because most of these poems, with the exception of things like Paradise Lost, and some of the things of Beowulf, when they were popular, were not written down. They were all oral. It was all oral tradition. So bards would basically just have to memorize all of it. And so you had to have this scheme, this pentameter, this meter, to have a good way of remembering what your lines are. And so that's like some of the defining characteristics. More of the defense of why I think they're important. Speaking of the Mahabharata, it was an oral composition that was purely heroic in character, but it also deals with people dealt in the original quote. So I'm quoting from a book, Traditions of Heroic and Epic Poetry, the Traditions. It's on Google Books if you want to look it up. It'll be in the sources. But it deals with people and events of which the earlier Brahmanical, so a Brahmin was a priest in Indian. It was the priest caste. Brahmanical literature had taken practically no notice. And so I thought that was interesting, and it gets even more interesting later when you start reading more about like the later history of the Mahabharata. You basically have this priest caste, because a lot of the writing and the literature and even like the oral tradition was very mechanical. It was very religious, and it was very controlled by the priest caste. But then with the emergence of the Mahabharata, there was a separate caste. I'm gonna butcher this again. It's Kshatriyas. Kshatriyas. K-S-A-T-R-I-Y-A-S. They were warriors and princes, and they basically came up with a counter narrative of like, we want representation. And so that's where a lot of this epic poem came from. And even though that was the cast that wrote it, the bard cast just like, there wasn't a bard cast, but there were bards, singers, and there's another word they used to describe, and I forget, I think called like the sutras. That was the name of the peoples who spread the poem. They just took it and ran with it. They just performed it, they spread it, and it was almost like a cultural change, because then when Smith talks later about how other pieces made after the epic poem were very derivative of that source.
Okay.
In terms of their style, in terms of the way that they were written, in terms of like some of the content. And so it was interesting, at least to me, to think about how someone was like, oh yeah, we're gonna just make an epic poem of this his heroic character no one's really thought about before, because it's not what the priests were preaching. And it just made this huge shift. I think it's funny and weird that there's like a cultural war that kind of was going on, because then the Brahmins eventually appropriated the Mahabharata and just like added a pile of just like, I don't want to say tyrannical or heretical or whatever, but it was just preachings they just added into the epic poem, drastically increasing its length, and making it a completely different thing than it was when it was first made. And you know, part of the argument is that it's interesting that literature of this form can be so divisive between the two groups and used as like, I was going to use an example, but I won't use that example. Just in a tug of war, I'll say, between two different cultures within the same culture, within the same society. And so yeah, so I think in the defense of reading epic poems, or the genre as a whole, I do think that you can glean a lot from the stories. There's a lot of good rooted narrative writing, you know, depending on what you're reading, because like I said, the Mahabharata kind of just became polluted, for lack of a better way of putting it. But if you go back to things like Beowulf, the Odyssey, the Iliad, figuring out like what those core elements of painting this world, even like what Tolkien has done. You and I have also had discussions about Tolkien and how it hasn't aged well.
Right. Tolkien, in my opinion, and this may be heresy, but I've said it to you, and I think you agree with me. Like, I enjoy Tolkien. I enjoy The Hobbit. I actually enjoy The Hobbit more than The Lord of the Rings, the book version, not the movies. I think The Hobbit has aged better as a story than The Lord of the Rings has, just because of its self-containedness. However, it's my opinion that Tolkien was a better world builder than he was a storyteller. Yeah.
And I think that the same could be said for some of these epic poems, is they are better world building than they are storytelling. Because there's even like a lot of mythological prose, I guess you could say, like especially in the Greek history or the Greek mythology, that has been pulled from some of the poems, like the Iliad, the Odyssey, and derivatives of them. And so that would be another thing that I would say in defense of the genre is that it does teach a decent amount of world building. Even like Dante's Inferno, as much as I don't like that epic poem, they build a world. Dante builds a world. I don't think the story is told very well, and I don't think it's a great story, but he does. I have to admit that he does do a good job of actually building his world how he sees it. And yeah, I'd say to any person who is interested in writing, I would say that these are important. To anyone who's just looking for like entertainment, yeah, you can skip it.
Well, I was gonna say if you had to suggest 2 or 3 epic poems to just someone to read for any purpose, just to say that you did it, or that you think that they would get the most value of it for something other than just a scholarly reason for reading
like
it.
Way of studying.
Yeah. What 2 or 3 would you say? Yeah, I would give this a go.
I like Gilgamesh. He is a cool character. It's interesting. It's very, Superman-esque, I'd say. One of the downsides to epic poems is definitely their age. And so they're very male-centric, which I don't like. They're very much like the male protagonist. But having said that, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Beowulf, because Beowulf just goes and hunts monsters and fights stuff because it's cool. And then I'm more of a fan of the Aeneid than I am of the Odyssey. You have to find a good translation of it and do that, but I think those would be the ones I would pick because some of the other ones are very I don't want to say Christian-centric is a bad thing, but they definitely were heavily influenced by the church, by the Christian church.
They became more propaganda than story.
The same with what I would say the Mahabharata, what happened with that, with the Brahmins, the same thing happened with the Christian church. So you have things like Paradise Lost, which is like the story of Adam and Eve. Dante's Inferno is very propaganda-ish. I don't remember much of the Song of
very
Roland.
Very bad doctrinally, I will say. just gonna throw that out there too.
Well, they do climb down Satan's penis in one scene, and to anyone who didn't know that, now you do.
Yeah. Now, the more you know is not always a good thing.
Yeah. Also, the Mahabharata is very long. It's over 200,000 verse lines, as well as long prose passages, so at like about 1.8 million words. It's about twice the length of the Shahnameh, 4 times the length of another Indian epic poem, Ramayana, and roughly 10 times the length of the Iliad and the Odyssey combined. So very long, very tainted, I'll say, very propaganda-ish at this point, which I kind of am sad because I would want to read the original Mahabharata as it was written by the Kshatriyas. I'm sorry. I want to be able to pronounce the names right, but I can't because I'm bad.
Yeah. No, again, like I said, just wait till I go. You'll feel great. You'll feel great about your life.
I'm sure I'll feel fantastic. But yeah, that would be what I would come up with as examples of like, hey, this is something to read. I think, the way that some of the stories are told, so like the Odyssey, for example, again, to use the reimagining of an older concept, something that I, back when I had TikTok, I might have talked about this on the podcast before. I don't remember. I definitely have told you about this.
We have a whole season of stuff episodes that are no longer available, so
that's fair. For good reason, by the way.
For very good reason.
For very good reason. Sound quality, terrible. Yeah, so what was I saying? Oh yeah,
TikTok.
That on TikTok, the Epic the Musical.
Oh
is
yes, yes.
The musical of the Odyssey. Super cool. I love everything about it because I'm not the biggest fan of musicals. I'll be the first to admit that. But a good operatic thing, like, I find that interesting. I enjoyed the Les Mis movie.
Yes.
With Russell Crowe and
yes,
I thought that was good. I like that kind of storytelling, and so it's basically, I don't know what the life cycle of this thing is, but the dude who's running it is really serious about it. He's hired like a cast to either at least record and get all like the copyright stuff down, and so it's basically just the story of the Odyssey, but in musical form, and like he does really cool things with the gods, and the more divine a character is, and I put divine in air quotes, the more modern the music is, and the more you have like a techno aspect to it, and then like the more human the character is, the more simple the more simple the music is, the more simple and traditional the singing is. And I think I just love that reimagining of older, old, definitely stale at this point, bringing new life to some of this stuff.
As an aside or a tangent, though, off of your musical commentary, for any of you who are interested, the difference, I would say the pure difference between like a Disney, we'll call it a Saturday night made for TV movie musical, and the actual, what I refer to as Broadway level musical, even if it's off Broadway, like what you were mentioning with Les Mis, or if anyone's ever seen The Greatest Showman.
Yeah, that was actually really good.
Is that it's not just a movie with song and dance numbers in it.
Yes.
The music is so well thought out. Like if you listen to any good Broadway sound score, the main theme, like the melody of whatever the main song of the musical is generally found, at least the chord progression is generally found in all of the songs.
Hey Victor.
What?
We have talked about that on the podcast before, if briefly. Do you know what that's called?
I know it has something to do with math.
It's a leitmotif.
Yes.
It doesn't really have anything to do with math, but I've talked about
Oh, that's right. Yes, I do remember, because
a leitmotif.
You have a piano on your new phone, and you've been doing music things.
Well,
that was just the context that I remember it, because you were playing side tangent. We were driving to Virginia, and I accidentally, crossing lanes and going around a turn in Pennsylvania, hit the rumble strip. Oh no, it was a bridge. We went over a bridge.
Over the bridge, and you hit the rumble strip on the bridge.
And you were like, what chord is that? And I'm like, what?
I didn't say what chord is that. I said what frequency.
Oh, what frequency is that? And you brought a piano up on your phone.
I believe it was C3.
Yeah, and started playing piano notes on your phone. Anyway,
to bring it back, to come up a bit from that deep dive into that rabbit hole. Right, leitmotifs. It was in the context of video game music, probably, but I think that if you can tell a story, like if I could listen to the soundtrack and have a good understanding of the story, I think that's a good musical. Yeah. Like I said, I'm not the biggest fan of musicals, because
and I would say
Wicked, can't stand. I also can't stand that for other reasons, but still, can't stand it. What's the one with the street gang that's like Romeo and Juliet? West Side Story.
West Side Story. Yeah.
Can't stand it.
I was gonna say that, generally speaking, I have discovered that musicals either have a good story and a decent to bad musical score, a great musical score with a decent to unentertaining story, And when you come across things like Les Mis, The Greatest Showman, is when you finally find that perfect mix of both. And I know the guy on TikTok that you're talking about. I've heard some of the compositions that he's put together, and I would agree that he has something there. And I would love to see it go further than just TikTok and hear more about it. That's when you get something that's like timeless.
If it was on Broadway, I would be down to go to New York and watch it on Broadway.
Absolutely.
And even to go back to the movie musical Les Mis, the Valjean's soliloquy, and so to go back to that leitmotif idea, Valjean's soliloquy and the Javert's suicide, they're the same tune, the same score,
right?
The same music. There's just different undertones with both of them, and like that, I love that kind of musical storytelling. And again, to bring this back into the context of epic poetry, I mean, if you've ever looked at a copy of Les Mis, it might as well fall into the same character. It really doesn't fall in the same genre, but it definitely falls under the same idea of this very stale, hard to get through. And that is where I think the merit is in that genre of epic poetry and stale literature. This is an argument for stale literature and stale stories. I've read fresh life into
I've read the unabridged version of Victor Hugo's Les Mis, and
you're insane.
Yeah, and I gotta say, I'm glad that things like the musical exist because there are story elements within it that are phenomenal, like stories of redemption, story of being so stalwart and unchanging can be a flaw, even if you are righteous, like Javert is. Yeah. Like, he is so by the book, things are black and white, that it ends up being his downfall. Like, those are all really good themes.
Quite literally.
Yeah. Those are all really good themes, but if they only existed within Victor Hugo's Les Mis, I mean, they would all be lost. The story would be dead.
I'm sure they would come up somewhere, sometime, but it might not have the same effect as someone who recognized the themes in somewhere else and say, I can do this better, and then goes and does it better. Yeah. Or I can do this. No, yeah, I can do this better. Really is what it comes down to.
That's the desk.
It is the desk. You know, the dog always walks by it and like smacks her head on it. And I'm like, just duck under it. Like, just go around it. You know it's there by now. Do you enjoy doing it? I don't know.
All right, my go.
Yeah, I think that just about wraps it up for my ideas on epic poetry. As a, just a side note, as I was thinking about like how very male centric they are, it would be kind of cool to see that kind of story having life breathed into that idea. I don't like stories that are just like the same story but told with a differently changed character for some reason. So like, if someone took Pocahontas and said like, what if we made Pocahontas a dude? That's boring, right?
Right.
But if you take the heart
of it and like
of the story of Pocahontas,
make a story,
right?
Yeah.
So like, if you took the heart of the Odyssey and said like, what if it was like a female protagonist? All on board. I love it.
Again, that's why I'm glad that Les Mis exists in other mediums, because yes, we talk about Valjean, we talk about Javert. There are some in the book, not in every media adaptation, but in the book there are some really strong female characters. In that, my favorite character is not Cosette. It is Eponine, who basically dies in the protection of the man that she loves, so that he can go and live a happy life.
Yeah, because
with the woman that he loves, which is not her.
Right.
It's almost like a Mulan thing.
It's like a tragedy.
She disguises herself as a man so that she can follow him onto a battlefield and save his life.
Right.
And I see it as sad. I don't necessarily see it as tragic because she doesn't do any of that as a manipulation or in the hopes, and this might just be because I've read the unabridged version, in the hopes of him loving her. She knows right away that he never will, but she loves and cares about him so much that she's willing to
this is
protect him even if he never reciprocates that love.
Our boat is straying slightly from course.
Well, yeah, probably.
However, the last thing that I'll say is I see that, but the reason why I call it tragic is because it's a character who has a gaping flaw succumbing to it.
True.
Because it is, not to say that she doesn't genuinely love and care about
I don't even remember his name. That's how unimportant a character he is to me. I don't care.
Marius,
yes.
You know how I remember his name?
You sang the song in your head, didn't you?
I did sing
I was going through it in my head.
I'm a ghost, Marius in love at last.
Yes.
I've never heard him ooh and ah. You talk of battles to be won, and here he comes like Don Juan. It is better than an opera.
Yes.
Yeah,
Anyway.
great song. The other one is, oh, dude, empty chairs and empty tables.
Don't. I will cry. I will openly cry right now.
Goes on and on.
Oh.
Empty chairs and empty tables where my friends are dead and gone. Yeah, great song.
Great song. Anyway, yeah.
But yeah, that's why I call it tragedy, is because, she does genuinely care about Marius, but it's like unhealthy amount, and so
okay,
it's a gaping character flaw that's being laid into, which is good. Like, it's good to have those characters. It's good to have that tragedy, because then you look at yourself and say, hey, what are my gaping character flaws that I'm
could
embracing?
lead to my death?
Yeah. Or
Which
not
happens.
even your death, but just not.
Well, I just say that because many of the people, it leads them to their death.
Oh, yeah.
In Les Mis. Hey, so let's talk about another obscure form of literature. Hard pivot.
To you.
So
hard. Take that ship wheel and just crank it.
Just crank it back. So.
Oh wait, one more side note, because real quick, because speaking of making you cry, but when we're done, because this is kind of relevant because Overwatch 2 just came out. Dude, the Overwatch animated shorts, they'll rip your heart out. Okay. Some of them will. I don't know if you've seen them, but when we're done here,
even knew that they exist.
Yeah, when we're done here, I'm making you watch all of them.
Sounds good. Anyway,
now to your thing.
So I stumbled upon this genre of literature mainly because it was recommended to me via the algorithm on Audible of the random things that I would listen to while pumping gas. Again, Audible is not a sponsor unless they would like to be.
I'm totally down.
Anyway, and so I'm going to start by saying that I was watching a comedian earlier. I can't remember his name, but he made this statement. He was talking about science and how everything doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. And he was saying, do you think you're in the United States? Zoom out. So in that thought process, I say this is an obscure subgenre of literature because I live in the United States. Mm-hmm. If you are outside of the United States, mainly in Asia, it is not. Mm-hmm. And honestly, it's not really obscure anymore, and it's found ways to sneak into even our Western media and storytelling. But in order to talk about the specific genre I want to talk about, I need to talk about another genre of Chinese literature in order to give context to it. So also, I apologize for every mispronunciation. I do not speak Cantonese or Mandarin or any of these, and I'm just going off of basically written how it sounded translations. So the first one that I'm going to talk about is the genre of wuxia, which is spelled W-U-X-I-A. And this is from Wikipedia, the definition. It says, it literally means martial heroes. It is a genre of Chinese fiction concerning the adventures of martial artists in ancient China.
So it's very on brand for you.
But it's also, see, it's very specific, and so we're going to get to that. Although wuxia is traditionally a form of fantasy literature, its popularity has caused it to be adapted for such diverse art forms as Chinese opera, television dramas, films, and video games. It forms part of popular culture in many Chinese-speaking communities. I've got another thing on wuxia, which is, this is from, it's right there. You hit the table. Did it too. I always hit the thing. Anyway, this is actually from Whistlekick, put out a publication for a little while, which is another project that they're going to go back to. It is called... I'll get what it's called in a second. But in the first issue, they had an article called "What is Wuxia?" And it's just interesting that it was on brand. So I'm just going to read from that article the common themes, plots, and elements. Modern wuxia stories are largely set in ancient or pre-modern China. Again, it's that specific. Some stories are set in very specific time periods in Chinese history, while others are more vague with the settings that can't properly be pinned down in one era or another. Almost every wuxia hero is an expert martial artist with abilities beyond the common person, often involving superhuman skills, like the ability to jump very high and almost levitate, use of pressure points to paralyze, harm, or heal, and the manipulation of internal energy or qi, or ki. Swordsmanship skills are also quite common.
Do they have a power pole though?
So here's the thing.
Staff that can extend as long as you want?
Yeah. So this is from the Martial Journal, which was a Whistlekick publication that put out a couple issues. So most popular Western wuxia story would be Crouching Tiger and Hidden Dragon. If you want to think of something that is very, very wuxia, Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon would be it. And I watched it. I thought it was good. I honestly say I have a lot more appreciation for it now as an adult than I did at the time that I watched it.
I would have to go back and rewatch it. It has been a while.
Right. I also, at the time, didn't understand the concept of they're supposed to be flying around. They're supposed to be kind of superhuman, and I looked at it more as a martial arts film when I should have been looking at it as a superhero film. Because that's really more closer to what it is, or at least like Robin Hood, like a folk hero-y type deal. And again, this is why I say we're in the United States, zoom out, there's a whole world. We're on a planet, and a lot of the fantasy that we read, we talk about Tolkien, even C.S. Lewis, even the Odyssey and stuff, it's Western-based. So I'm talking about now fantasies that jump into the more Eastern part of the world, things that for their culture is part of normalcy. Right. For us, it is not. So the subgenre that I'm going to talk about of wuxia is actually, and again, I am so sorry, but I'm just gonna have to go with how Google Translate told me to pronounce this. But is Xianxia.
Xianxia, I believe. Xianxia.
Xianxia, as someone who is actually in China, I will trust you on that.
It's been a while. My pronunciation has always been bad.
So this isn't okay. So it literally means immortal heroes. It's a Chinese fantasy genre that focuses on characters that undergo meditation and training to become transcendental beings. It is often called cultivation fantasy, which is what I'm going to refer to it as from now on, because that's a lot easier for me to say because I speak the worst spoken language in the world, English. Cultivation fantasy by Western readers. So here, this is all from tckpublishing.com. Here's some key characteristics of cultivation fantasy. It's very similar to wuxia, which focuses on the adventures of martial heroes in ancient China. Many consider it to be a fantasized version, so it's basically more fantasy, whereas wuxia would be Robin Hood. Cultivation novels would be more along the lines of Lord of the Rings.
Would you consider Journey to the West as cultivation fantasy?
Oh, we will get there.
Okay.
Because I've got examples and stuff as we're moving through here.
Got it.
And it gets really obscure, and I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that you and I aren't raised in this culture, and so we don't really. There are things that they consider necessary for a cultivation fantasy, and then things that they consider necessary for a wuxia. So anyway, focuses on adventures in ancient China. In fact, many consider it. We did that already. In Western terms, you can think wuxia as low fantasy, while cultivation is high fantasy.
To those, who might not know the difference between those two.
Oh, yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, I honestly don't know the difference between low and high fantasy. Couldn't tell you.
Oh, okay. High fantasy is Lord of the Rings.
Okay.
And think of in-depth, crazy world building, stuff like that. That would be your quintessential high fantasy. Low fantasy. I'm trying to think of a good book example. Low fantasy. Okay, this is maybe not the best example, and some people may smack me for it. Low fantasy would be more something like not the Chronicles of Narnia, but specifically The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. It can be self-contained. There isn't this grand scope of a world around them, like this in-depth. Like, it's not a world that comes with its own depth of lore and mythology.
Got it.
It's just a fantastical story. So think if you were to watch.
So to have a really obscure pool that no one is gonna get because we deleted all that shit. Character centric versus story centric, or what was it? Event centric versus character centric.
Kind of. But see, that I struggle with because, and I'm gonna get to why, because you can have character-centric stories that take place in a high fantasy. Dragon Age is a high fantasy.
Got it.
But even so, Dragon Age 2, which takes place in one city, seems like a smaller, more character-centric story. But it is but it is still high fantasy because there's that depth of lore going on. Low fantasy is more just something of self-contained. Maybe if you just it only goes into lore so much as it's the established lore of the reader. So fairy tales. Fairy tales, oh my gosh, why did it take me so long to get there? Fairy tales are a fantastic example of low fantasy.
Snow White.
Yeah, right. Curses and stuff like that, that's still fantastical, but it's just not explained. You don't know where the apple came from. You don't know why the witch is the way she is and where she got her powers.
Don't even know the name of the kingdom that she's the princess of.
None of that's important. It's a fantasy story.
Right.
It's low fantasy.
Got it.
All right. that took me so much longer to get to than I really wanted to. Anyway, it's easy to get confused between the two. I should have just read the next thing. As they share many characteristics that frequently cross over. Some of the major similarities are being set in ancient China and focusing on martial arts.
Specifically ancient China. So you wouldn't consider something like Enter the Dragon as any form of that media or form of that genre?
It's not me, it's...
Right.
It's the writer of the publication, right. And we'll get into that as I start going through the same publisher's list of what categorizes. And they have a whole page for wuxia too, of what categorizes wuxia and then what categorizes these cultivation novels. Both are influenced by Taoism and Buddhism, although wuxia is limited to the philosophies, while the cultivation is free to utilize them in more fantastical ways. And now, in the midst of that, I'm just going to go right into it. So it's called cultivation, and the first thing on their list of things that categorize it as a cultivation novel or a xian xia is cultivation. Characters often practice martial arts or mystical arts to become stronger and extend their lives. This process is called cultivation, and people that do it are called cultivators. So you got stuff like they'll meditate, they'll physically train their bodies, and they talk a lot about like opening their meridians, channeling, and getting into different levels of enlightenment that bring them steps closer to immortality.
Got it.
The second thing that that cultivation novels, fantasies have are magical beings, and this is where we're talking about the lore, where while wuxia is limited to what is believable, albeit exaggerated to great proportions, cultivation novels take full advantage of the fantastical elements drawn from Chinese mythology and folklore. Supernatural creatures like demons, spirits, and magical beasts are a fixture in cultivation world. They act as protectors or destroyers and often provide the protagonist with the opportunity to advance their cultivation, getting them closer to becoming basically immortal beings themselves. And some of these beings started as cultivators themselves. This is where I'm going to talk about Journey to the West, or The Monk and the Monkey, as the shortened abbreviated version that I have is called, or sometimes you can find other translations just called Monkey King. I would constitute Monkey King as more of... It's hard to call it a cult of the English word we're using for it, because no one's really trying to, through meditation, become immortal.
Well, but it's been a while since I've read anything about them. From my understanding, you have the three disciples and the monk is basically like their spiritual guide in their journey to the Western.
And there's different versions of it. There's some versions where like the three of them literally are demons and are like terrible monsters.
Well, that was my understanding, was that they were protecting this monk on his journey as a way of atonement.
Right, yeah. So I would more...
And I don't know enough about the genre to say, but like atonement says the same thing to me that cultivation does, because you're trying to better yourself.
I could see that. I could see that. I will come back to it because I do have a note from this publisher, specifically on Wukong. So the third thing that they have are magical items. These cultivation novels have an abundance of magical items that take many forms. The most common of these are magical pills or elixirs that boost a character's cultivation, and their potency depends on the rarity and strength of their ingredients. If a lot of this is sounding like how Western RPGs are structured, there's a reason for that. They're structured this way, honestly, because it was one of the many things that we stole from East Asian culture that it just makes sense. Honestly, leveling systems being one of them. And then apotheosis. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Apotheosis?
Apotheosis is the transformation of a mortal into a god. Cultivation novels regularly feature characters who have already reached the peak of cultivation, achieved immortality, and turned into gods. They often give out advice, create mischief, and direct characters to a specific path. A great example of a mortal reaching apotheosis is Sun Wukong from The Journey to the West. Though the novel is not exactly Xiangxia, cultivation, having existed way before the genre was given a name, it chronicles how Wukong, known as the Monkey King, journeys to find immortality and attain Buddhahood.
Okay. Question.
Yes, I kind of have an idea of what your question is, but go ahead.
I guess more of a comment is I don't see how that invalidates it from belonging to the genre because it existed before the genre existed.
1,000%.
For example, the fact that you could categorize Sherlock Holmes as gaslamp fantasy, even though gaslamp fantasy is super recent in terms of being dubbed a genre.
Right. Absolutely. So I'm gonna skip the next thing that I had because it kind of goes, well, what I want to say kind of goes off of that, because in all of this,
right,
I started a search for what constitutes, like, what are modern examples of Xiangxia and Wuxia.
I like one of your notes.
Which one?
I'll say when you get there.
Okay.
I read it as I was scrolling through your notes, and I looked at it, and I was like, "That's funny. I like that. It's true."
Yeah, is the fact that people started. I found myself on a Reddit page, which is never good, and in the comments, someone asking a question. Like, listen, asking a question.
On Reddit, you have to be in the right Reddit, and even then, it's spooky.
It's like walking through a minefield naked. It just is not. It's never wise. It can be entertaining though.
Yeah.
So
it can end well. The chances are not in your favor.
So someone asked. Yeah. No. Someone asked if a specific form of Western, or a specific example of Western media was wuxia, or I should say was Xiangxia specifically, and it got livid. Like, it got so bad. Like, people were saying, well, of course, because it hits this point, this point, this point. Then other people, well, it doesn't hit this point, this point, this point. Other people, well, if you say that this is that, then you have to say that Naruto is, and Naruto is Japanese, and this. So then we get into, I made a TikTok, speaking of TikTok, a long time ago. And I knew this wasn't the proper word for it, but I referred to it as a Chinese anime, meaning an anime style short film that was produced by a Chinese company. And I'm pretty sure in whatever, I was like, I know that's not the word for it, but I don't know. I'm speaking out of ignorance. And I was bombarded by, you can't call this an anime, it didn't come from Japan. When again, if you look at Japan, anything that is animated is an anime, because that's what the word means. Okay? And so one of the things that I discovered in that deep dive on that Reddit page was people are super protective of things. And so when you ask the question of, just because something procures something, does that not mean that it can fall into that genre? I.e., is Journey to the West a cultivation story, even if that wording for it didn't exist?
So, you know, side notes are a thing. And this is just from Wikipedia, so you take it with a grain of salt. Anime is hand-drawn and computer-generated animation originating from Japan. Outside of Japan and in English, anime refers to specifically to anime refers specifically to animation produced in Japan. However, in Japan and in Japanese, anime, a term derived from a shortening of the English word animation, describes all animated work regardless of style or origin.
So there you have it.
Take that as you will. I won't say one way or another.
Right.
But you can just take that as you will.
So one of the things, though, and this is when we talk about themes, right? The whole Reddit page was on whether or not Avatar was a xiangxia. Mm-hmm. And one of the things, if you go back to my original list by this TD or TCK Publishing, mm-hmm. is one of the things that makes it specific. And I found some other sources that I'm not listing because I can't find them anymore, but I read it in multiple places. Isn't so much that they take place in ancient China, mm-hmm. but it was more so the fact that the predominant lore and world building is based off of a strictly Chinese mythos. So I wouldn't categorize Avatar as wuxia or xingxia, mm-hmm. because it more tells a Western idealistic fantasy story with Eastern heavily elements in it.
Yes.
They're not. Yes, they're spirits, and they're more Eastern-based spirits than Western-based fantasies.
It's more Western with Eastern influence than Eastern with Western influence.
And that's what I discovered seemed to be the main thing. And so I have a list of things that I compiled. If, say, like, I want to get into this, like these
that was the note. Literally any anime.
Yeah, these type of things, but I'm not sure, like, if I want to go straight into it, because listen, there are some things, like, there's almost zero learning curve. Like, in some of the examples of recommended reading, like, because I'm going to give recommended reading for this genre specifically. I'll give it for both too. Like, they don't explain some lore to you. They'll just say things expecting that you have a knowledge basis. Like, if I'm in any Western group of people and I talk about Robin Hood or I mention Robin Hood, mm-hmm. most people have a basis for that. Most people have a basis for Sun Wukong. Mm-hmm. Like, in the Western circles, you have to call him the Monkey King. But
I think with the multiple iterations, Sun Wukong gets around.
Yeah. Anyway, so Avatar, specifically The Last Airbender, more so than Korra, though some seasons of Korra that really delve into the spiritual aspect of things. But I think Avatar, The Last Airbender is a better way to kind of sate that appetite for a more Eastern-influenced fantasy story. Mm-hmm. Plus, even the idea of the Avatar constantly dying and being reborn, that's a type and form of immortality. Mm-hmm. Literally any anime that we said. And again, like, these aren't just like the spiritual things and the list of things that we talked about. It's kind of in how they structure their stories. Because I found in just the few versions that the few stories that I'm reading within this genre, that they are they care way more about the individuals in the story than necessarily what they're doing. Like, there's a lot of things where the story will be self-contained, have a beginning, middle, and end, and then the next book in the series just involves the same person doing something else completely unrelated, mm-hmm. but also just further down his road to enlightenment or cultivation.
And now for something completely different.
Right. On Netflix, you can watch Into the Badlands, mm-hmm. which, fun fact, Into the Badlands narratively is based off of The Journey to the West.
Interesting.
Right.
I did not get that from Into the Badlands.
I didn't either, but there's definite homages to it, like the one the one kid who becomes, first of all, Sunny's name, Sunny is Sun Wukong. Mm-hmm. And the kid's name is MK, which would be Monkey King, but Like there's I wouldn't say it's based off of, but
I would say there's cute references. I wouldn't.
Well, no,
say.
but it highly homages the storytelling, the narrative. Highly homages the themes of Journey to the West. That's from the writer and producer.
Right.
Himself.
Yeah. I don't doubt that. I'm just thinking. I would have to have been told that. I don't think I would have been able to pick that up.
Yeah, I would. I brought it up just because I was told it. Star Wars, especially if you read some of the Legends stuff, anything that has to do with Jason Solo, where it really talks a lot about Force philosophy and, him trying to find his way as a Jedi who isn't a warrior. It kind of takes a dark turn, but I mean,
Jason Solo taking a dark turn. What do you mean?
It is,
what does he possibly do?
It is, I think he burns an entire planet for one, just to prove a point.
Yeah.
But that is a type that I'm not saying it falls in this genre, but these are examples of Western culture things that could introduce you to some of the subplots and some of the narrative archetypes that will make your transition into this subgenre, if you want to go into it, a little bit more easy. There's a book series that I also discovered on Audible called The Mortal Techniques by Rob J. Hayes. Right now there's just 3 of them. You can read those 3 books in any order, or you could just read one of them. They're complete self-contained stories, but they all exist within the same world. I would say that they're more Japanese influenced, but they're definitely more. There's events happening, but then they focus in on the characters that are in them.
So what you're saying is that these are, for people who are used to Western ways of storytelling, these are Western-styled stories with heavy
Eastern influences. Yes.
So that's as a way to ease into the genre.
That's what literally any anime, and I was thinking about this.
I wouldn't say literally.
No,
it wouldn't be literally any anime. Most anime, most fantastical anime, not your slices of lives.
No, I mean
slices of lives.
Yeah, Naruto.
Life slices. I don't know.
Naruto, Demon Slayer, My Hero Academia to a degree, even though that's more like superhero-ish.
Sure.
But speaking of superhero-ish, comic books do this. Now, I am crazy, and I am someone who has read Amazing Spider-Man from issue 1, like the comic books, from issue 1 all the way through issue 900. Obviously, that is not one...
It's because you're a fanatic.
Yeah. Obviously, that is not one whole story. There's a lot of retconning that goes in there. There's a lot of different things. But the way that comic books work is that you are basically handing a character or an archetype over to a writing group and having them write a story for that character to live through. So those characters are very much so not so much about the story that they're in, it's about how that character, it's a character-focused story, so how that character is relating to the story that they find themselves in. Like, to go back to that deep dive that no longer exists, our character-centric versus event-centric storytelling.
Not like in that form. It'll come back in a different form when we redo it and do it better. See, it's like an epic poem.
Right. However, if Spider-Man obviously is like a very popular choice, I would recommend you read any of the newer, listen to this now, Marvel itself would say this, the newer Shang-Chi comic books. Do not go back to the old ones, like the first publication ones.
Oh God.
They're very racist.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Marvel even so knows so. I'm pretty sure that there are some compiled compendium editions have warnings in the beginning of them now, because people are imperfect. But they just started one called Shang-Chi and the Ten Rings. Not because of the popularity of the movie. It's not, there are different 10 rings than that. It's something similar, but else it's a good story. The new run on Iron Fist, again, not the Netflix original series. We're talking comic books right now, reading material. The Netflix original series had its moments. Most of them did not involve Danny Rand. I love Colleen in that. Love her character. The girl with the sword. Great. She's awesome. But the recent Iron Fist stuff is good. Actually, Danny Rand passed the Iron Fist on to an actual Asian individual. So it's a little bit less white guy takes...
Whitewashed.
You know, whatever. There are some Danny Rand stories. Like, I think that there's a set of 3 graphic novels that take place in Kunlun that are really good. It's like a tournament arc, but it's the immortal weapons, because the immortal Iron Fist is one of the 7 immortal weapons of the 7 heavenly cities. So there's other immortal weapons, and he has to fight them.
So a tournament arc.
Absolutely, and it's great. So that is, if you are used to Western storytelling and you want to start to sate your curiosity to see if these are the style of stories that you would like. Again, we're going to have a reference page and stuff, a citation, sources and whatnot. I was talking about trying to figure out why some of these are so popular, just some things of note. These stories generally involve an everyman who then begins down a journey of greatness.
Right,
everyone loves
a story of growth.
Everyone loves stories like that. I've already said this to its death. They're more character focused as opposing to sweeping stories like Western fantasies. I think that they are attractive because they treat the mystical as if it's common, with still maintaining its intrigue. Like, it's common knowledge that everyone can meditate and unlock these different levels, but not everybody does it. You know, that's something that I think is just a mystery, but also intriguing. Also, the story the character-centric story thing, we talk about Dungeons and Dragons all the time, right? How I run campaigns, we've talked about how you like campaigns. There is no big bad. It's just people progressing in their own personal stories that just happen to be interacting with the world. Right. I think that's something, there's something to be said about books that tell that story. So, finally, reading recommendations. I'm going to start with I'll start with wuxia. And then we'll get more fantastical from there. Okay. So there is the most well-known Western wuxia story is called The Legend of the Condor Heroes. It is a really bad translation, I've been told, because condors don't exist in China. But because of the growing popularity...
Do unicorns exist, though?
Listen, don't. Because of the growing popularity, a new updated translation in, I think it's a series of 5 books, has come out of the Legends of the Condor Heroes. The first one by, again, sorry about this, Jin Yang. It is called A Hero Born. And that is on my list for when I drive to Kansas.
Tomorrow.
Well, leaving tomorrow through Sunday.
Yeah.
So there's that. Then there is The Order of the Pure Moon Reflected in Water by Zen Cho. I bought this book. I owned this book before we conceived of this episode. I bought it because the cover was pretty and it was face out at Barnes & Noble. So Barnes & Noble employees are evil. It's really pretty. If you look it up, it's really pretty. I would just like to just have it sit on, even if I never read it, which I'm going to. It's a small book.
Put it in a glass case, you know?
Another one is The Empress of Salt and Fortune by NGHI. Any guesses? Nai?
NGHI.
Yeah. Anyway, Nai Vo is the author of that. So that's wuxia. And if you want to do cultivation stories, there is the Cradle series by Will White, Wigght. It starts with Unsold, which is the first volume of that. 1,000 Li by Tao Wong. This is the book that actually got recommended to me from the first one. It starts with a guy who just is a 17-year-old farmer.
Okay, wait. Are Li units of measurement of distance?
Yes, Li is a unit of measurement for distance.
You know how I know that? From reading The Art of War.
Yes.
He talks about
that again, but that's another thing. They don't explain that.
Right.
So I only knew that as well because of reading The Art of War. So yeah, I mean, 1,000 Li is about this, about the main character. The first book, it really just ends. I mean, it's about him getting into this martial arts sect, and there's 6 books. They're each organized in sets of 3, which I like. And the first 3 books are called The First Step, The First Stop, and The First War. The second 3 are called I don't know what all 3 of them are called, but they begin with The Second Sect, and I think all of them begin with second, and then the third set all begins with the third. Again, that the series is called 1,000 Li. That is what started me on this journey. The First Step, great book, really good, and the audio version of it, top-notch narration. Super important to have good narration in your audio versions. And then another one recommended by TCK Publishing, I know nothing about. It's called Street Cultivation by Sarah Lynn. This seems to be a cultivation novel that takes place more in a fantasy world and more modern times. The world of a world where martial arts is now largely controlled by corporations.
Interesting.
So that is the recommendation from the publisher that publishes the book series that I'm currently reading. I gotta say, like, I'm as a martial artist, obviously really enjoying it, but as a storyteller, some of the different ways that they go about telling stories is very interesting. How the narrative is constructed.
Fun fact: Yibai is not 1,000. Yibai is 100. Yi Qian is 1,000. Qian. Yeah.
So that thus concludes, I guess, our deep dive into kind of obscure genres. Yours being one that is dying, and mine being one that's at least becoming more popularized in the Western world.
Yeah.
Even though, again, it's been around. I liked your question of just because something existed before a subgenre was given its name.
Right.
I agree with you. I think that Journey to the West definitely falls into that. I will also say, if you go into these, you gotta really throw away the Western mentality of thinking. In a lot of senses, and I'll just say mainly. I mean, you have a little less of this because of who you are, but like in the Western world, demon good, demon bad, God good. In a lot of these, a demon is just a type of spirit, whether or not it's,
I think it's just poorly translated,
malicious or not. Yeah, a god can be mischievous, right? Can be not it's God really just implies powerful and immortal and sentient to a degree, because there are, in one of the stories, actually in a lot of the stories, but in the one that I'm reading, there are cultivation is anything that any living creature can do. So there are there are animals that are working towards their cultivation just through natural evolution.
Wasn't the horse in Journey to the West like a sentient creature?
Yeah, I believe so. If I'm remembering part of it correctly.
It has been a while.
Yeah.
But yeah, that wraps up our episode. This is the last episode that you will be here for.
Yes, I was going to say, this is our last episode, guys. Hope you enjoyed it.
Because you're going to Kansas and doing things there. So we will still be recording. We'll still be having podcasts on Spotify. We'll still be having streams on Twitch and podcasts on YouTube. Or videos on YouTube.
Videos on YouTube and on Apple Podcasts.
And on Apple Podcasts.
Like us on all the places. Follow us on all the places.
But yeah, you're just not going to be here. You're going to be in some random place in the middle of butt crack nowhere.
Yep, pretty much. And so it's a good thing next week's episode is supposed to be the most chaotic of our 3-episode cycle, because I don't even know
how we're going to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to be moved in probably 1 to 2 days prior.
Yeah, cool.
To us recording.
Cool.
So
good luck.
With a house that's going to have a couple dogs.
Couple dogs, couple kids,
a couple dogs,
a couple adults,
and a cat, and a couple guinea pigs, and a spider.
Oh, I'm sure there's more than just one spider.
All right, a tarantula named Anansi.
Named a what?
Anansi.
Like a nonce? Like a number only once?
Ansia. Anansia. I guess technically.
I don't know.
It's an African trickster god that often disguises itself as a spider.
Oh, I like that.
Right.
But yeah, thank you for stopping by. That's gonna be everything from us.
That is.
Where's my mouse cursor?
I can never.